You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Humulus lupulus, the incredible little flower that comes in myriad varieties, allowing brewers to impart their beer with characteristics ranging from earthy and spicy to floral and fruity and everything in between. While there are likely people out there who disagree, it's my personal belief that in order to call beer beer, it has to be made with hops, though the way in which the hops are used is dependent on the style being brewed. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss our experiences with different approaches to hopping beers is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, as I moved up here to Oregon at Oregon State University into hop country, I've certainly started to develop a much higher appreciation for hops. I mean, I think when I was living in Texas, when it's just miserably hot for, months out of the year, I enjoyed drinking crisp and refreshing light lagers. But man, up here in the Northwest, when it's nice and cool most of the time and rainy often, it's really nice to have a hoppy beer. So this one's I was honestly surprised we hadn't done an experience on approaches to hopping beer so this is cool. I'm glad that we get to talk about our experiences with how we get hops into this beverage that we love.
Yeah, and our personal experiences with doing that as well. And you and I have been brewing long enough that we have racked up quite a few different experiences doing different forms of hopping and such. Now, I'm sure most of our listeners know at this point that I'm a huge fan of crisp, clean lager styles, which aren't necessarily known for being too hoppy, but they absolutely must be made with hops. In fact, one of my personal favorite recipes is a very simple Pilsner hit with a moderate dose of Tettnanger toward the end of the boil, which imparts just the right amount, in my opinion, of floral and spice character that I love. Over the years, I've messed around with various approaches to hopping different styles of beers. I trust you have too, Cade, and it's going to be fun to chat about that with you today. So now, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. The YVH discount for this month is pretty great. If you ask me, $5 off each 1 pound bag of 2021 Lupa Max hops in any variety they have in stock. That's $5 off each 1 pound bag. So if you get 5 bags, you're saving $25 right there. Anyone who has used Lupa Max knows how killer this stuff is, and saving $5 on each bag just makes it even better. Our Q&A live cast guest for June of 2022 is Martin Keene of the Homebrew Challenge, a YouTube channel that documents Martin's plight to brew all 99 BJCP beer styles. Just an absolutely crazy challenge that I can't believe he completed. Now that he's completed this incredible challenge, Martin regularly posts high quality informative videos on brewing. It's an absolutely wonderful channel that I hope all of you go check out. If you want to be a part of his session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, June 24th, 2022, as Martin's going to be taking questions that Saturday, June 25th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online. It's absolutely painless. You simply click a link, do your shopping, and we get a little kickback for the referral. All right, feedback this week is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers some of the best stainless steel all-in-one brewing systems on the planet. If you're sick of filling propane tanks and burning your eyelashes off, it may be time to move to electric brewing, and we cannot recommend Clawhammer Supply enough. In addition to offering 120 and 240 volt systems in various sizes at reasonable prices, Clawhammer Supply has one of the best brewing related YouTube channels out there. I cannot recommend you subscribing and watching all of their videos enough. Head over to clawhammersupply.com to check out all of their killer gear. All right, feedback this week comes from listener Brian Ellis, who shared his thoughts on our Brews Views episode where we talked about our opinions about beer rating websites and apps. Brian said, I couldn't pass up on sharing an experience I had relating to the Untapped scene. When I was living in New England, I was invited to a beer share by a buddy that was hosted by a guy who was celebrating his 5,000th beer check-in. Holy cow. It was the most pretentious display of ego and ostentatiousness I've ever seen in beer circles. No slide against this guy in the act of checking in his 5,000th beer. That's his thing. No harm to me. The gross part wasn't the entire event was a, quote, look at me party. He says he shipped in Pliny the Elder, and for his 5,000th, he was going to check in Pliny the Younger while making sure everyone knew how much he spent on getting the beer. What was unbelievable was that this circle of friends were more interested in the dopamine hit of checking in the next rare beer than appreciating or enjoying the rest of the table, full of half open beers of Pliny the Elder, Treehouse, Hill Farmstead, and other half, to name a few. To each their own, but it simply became a bragging opportunity on social media. I have no issue with the idea of Untapped, but it is massively unappealing to me due to the fact that most of my friends that do use it are more excited to check a beer in than they are to actually enjoy the beer. Not to mention the inevitable drop in conversation that occurs as they switch to their phone to check a beer in while going, yeah. The silver lining of the party was no one was going to finish off any of the multiple bottles of Pliny, so my chaser beer between new beers that were open was an unlimited supply of Pliny the Elder. If you haven't seen it, you should look up the guy that created a fake brewery on social media with fake can releases and hype. He amassed quite a following of a fictional thing.
Oh, I remember that. That was a couple of years ago, right? Whenever that guy made the brewery just totally made up on Untapped and started and kept doing beer releases and getting people to like it and rate it even. Like that says like, I mean, people were rating it and talking about like the flavors of the beer too, which is just amazingly awesome. I mean, there's aspects of Untapped that I like. I like that brewers have access to a customer clientele, right? So you can say like, oh, we like this beer, we don't like this beer. I mean, it's going to be obvious in your sales numbers, but it's maybe tweaks that you can add to make the beer better instead of just scrapping a brand, right? So I like that aspect of it, but man, this guy's totally right. There is such a culture of people doing that, and my problem with Untapped is the negative reviews, right? I'm all for reviews, and people review us all the time, right? They give us feedback and honest feedback.
Yeah.
But and I appreciate that. But man, I mean, some of those websites, like especially, I mean, I don't know what Pliny the Elder rates at. I love Pliny, by the way. I think it's a fantastic beer. I think it's great. I don't know what it rates at, but I would be surprised if it's over 4.5. You know, just because there's a lot of people out there that are going to be like, oh, Pliny, I don't like it, just because that's fun to say, right? So they're going to rate it low or whatever. And I mean, I think the whole rating aspect of it is what my problem is. The social aspect and connecting is really cool. I was on Untapped for a while, but I'm terrible at social media, as most people probably know. But I loved checking in beers and being able to connect with other people and see what they're drinking, right? Especially close friends, like, oh, you're drinking this beer? Yeah, actually, I haven't had that in a while. I'll try it. I like that aspect, but as with anything, people can take it too far.
Yeah. Well, you know, kind of like Brian said, it does seem that people who like Untapped tend to kind of flock together. I was thinking about it after reading his comment originally, his feedback, that I can't think of a single one of my beer friends that uses Untapped regularly, or when they do, they're not pulling their phone out, you know, at the pub or anything. So it's interesting to me, and I wonder if maybe that's kind of, there's a delineation between like brewers and craft beer lovers who don't brew. You know, maybe there is. I don't know, but like you said, we live in a generation of trolls right now. People love to troll. They get their kicks off of being the one person to first say they don't like Pliny or whatever it might be. That's fine with me. It doesn't bother me. In fact, I think I mentioned this on that episode. I love when breweries turn negative reviews into kind of self-promotion. They're kind of funny, right? So I get it. It is what it is. I don't hate Untapped. I don't hate people who use it, but I can relate with Brian. And honestly, if I'm at a party where somebody's celebrating their 5,000th check-in with a bunch of Pliny that I don't have to pay for, I'm down. I'll go and I'll drink it all too. So thank you for the feedback, Brian. Pretty funny feedback actually, in my opinion. But there's a lot here that I agree with, like I mentioned, Brian. But to each their own. If you want to use Untapped, use Untapped. No one's really judging you. We're just having fun with this whole thing we call beer. All right, if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Time for a quick break. When we return, we're going to be discussing our experiences using different hopping approaches.
After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today.
When I started brewing nearly 20 years ago, I don't recall there being much talk about how to hop beers. It didn't matter if it was a Pilsner or an IPA. You made additions at 60 minutes for bitterness, 30 minutes for flavor, and 10 minutes for aroma. Nowadays, brewers have come up with a bunch of different methods for hopping beer, many based on specific styles. Now, this is a topic that can easily take us down a bunch of rabbit holes, which we're going to kind of try to avoid, but if it happens, forgive us. Hopefully you enjoy it. To keep things somewhat organized, I thought we could talk about our experiences hopping at different points in the brewing process, starting with the mash.
Yeah, so I think it makes a lot of sense to start like hot side and then go cold side. But so the mash is one of those places where this is, we just did an episode on hazy IPA and the no boil. And this is another one where I'm like, do people really add mash to the hops? And it turns out there's a lot of people that do that. And a lot of people have been doing it for a long time. I mean, German brewers did this, I think 100 years ago. And I was like, this is strange to me. Why would you put hops in the mash?
I do know what you're talking about, and I've done it quite a few times, in part because our friend, rest in peace, Tasty McDole, talked about doing it with Janet's Brown Ale. And so, I had that beer, I think right when Russian River released it as a Pro-Am, and it was so good. I thought there must be something to this mash hopping thing. I think even, later on down the line, even Tasty questioned whether it had contributed anything or not. But mash hopping it's an interesting technique that people use. And, there are certain things in brewing, and I don't mean to overspeak here, but there are certain things in brewing that have kind of an element of mystique. And I feel like mash hopping is one of those. You can't really say for certain the impact it does have, and we have not done an experiment on it yet, but it is coming, I promise. But there's, you get to the end of a finished beer and you're like, well, what part of this is the mash hop? You don't really know, right? When I've done it, the absolutely identifiable impact that it has is that my brewery smells amazing because, you've added hops to this nice warm mash, and the aromatics from those hops come out into the air and it smells phenomenal. So, on that point alone, adding a half ounce of Citra or whatever to the mash isn't a bad thing, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I love the way that the mash smells by itself, but adding hops in would be great. Now, fair disclosure, full disclosure, I've never done mash hopping, so I'm not going to be super helpful in terms of my own experiences here, but I can give a little bit of a nerdy sciencey understanding of what might happen, right? Because it turns out, and this is actually from Scott Janish, he published an article on this about mash hopping, which I thought was really fascinating. So we talk about this thiol thiol character a lot, right? Like fruity and tropical characters. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of like peptidases that are working in the mash to do a whole bunch of different things in the mash, which we don't have to go into, but they make bound thiol precursors. And so there are, thiol precursors in malt itself, but if you can add some hops in there, you might be able to increase your thiol concentration, which I always thought, thiols are just, dry hop and late additions. And, that's why you're just trying to put them in there so you can get all this like maximal, fruity characteristic, and it requires yeast and all this kind of stuff. But it turns out there's actually a pretty good argument for adding hops to the mash to increase thiol character. So like things like Sots, Calypso, Cascade, these hops that are high in bound thiols but not in free thiols, adding those to the hop or to the mash might actually increase your fruity characteristics in beer. So I was like, oh, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe I should try this thing.
Well, so what you're suggesting is when you do the mash hop experiment, Cade, is that to design it around a beer style where you want to free those bound thiols, which would be something like a hazy IPA, of course. So I think that you take what we know today in designing the experiment, and I think that that's a good way to approach it. Now, based on my personal experiences mash hopping, I didn't really get anything out of it that I felt, again, this was not an experiment. These are just personal experiences. I'd say like five or six different batches, completely different styles. I've done IPA, I've done Pilsner, I've done, brown ale using this technique, and I didn't really notice anything qualitative coming out of this method. And so I stopped doing it years ago. I only did it, again, like I said, 5 or 6 batches, and it was all in a row. It was consecutive batches, and I didn't notice anything, so I stopped. It felt to me like a waste of hops. But hey, maybe there is something to be had from it in the future. We just need an experiment to kind of flesh that out. Now,
and that's interesting too, right? I mean, you said there's no real qualitative impact, because if you think about it, when we add hops early in the boil, right, when we're boiling off a lot of aromatic compounds from hops, and what gets left behind are the like heavier oils and oxidized hop compounds like myrcene and linalool and geraniol. And those are floral compounds, or what I kind of just describe as hop character, right? And so it makes a lot of sense if you're adding these hops in the mash, and then you're just going to boil everything off. Maybe it's not going to make that much of a difference, or at least it's only going to incrementally make a difference. But the thiol thing is where I sort of scratch my head and go, okay, maybe there is a little something to this.
Me too. It makes the mash hopping thing far more interesting to me, if I'm being honest, because
exactly.
if you can get to the more of that thiol, that juicy fruity thiol character by mash hopping, then there is no reason not to do it, in my opinion, except for to save money on hops. But when you're shopping in bulk like we do, you're not saving that much anyways. And if it's making the beer better, then in my opinion, it's worth it.
Well, yeah, and I mean, people swear by first wort hopping too, right? Which is sort of right after the mash, right before the boil. So you're just you're racking off of the mash or loudering off of the mash into the boil kettle and adding hops there. And people swear by that. And I actually, so anecdotally on first wort hopping, I feel like what I notice is a difference. I've done it a couple of times in some Kolsch's or in German style beers, and I feel like it just gives this additional herbaceous note to it, like or maybe a floral character that's just a little bit incrementally higher than it would be if you just added hops to the boil, and boiled it from there. But that's sort of another interesting aspect, and that's one part that I have done is first wort hopping. So my experience there, first wort hopping, I would say is positive, but again, I know there was a brewlosophy experiment on it, but I don't remember the result.
We've done, I believe, 2, possibly 3, and they've all been non-significant. My experience with first wort hopping is that it has no impact whatsoever. I still do it all the time. I still do in terms of perceptible quality of the beer. The reason I first wort hop is one, it's easier, than adding hops to the boiling wort, because you're just doing it while you're removing the hop hop bag or whatever, or the grain bag, whatever it is. But also, everybody who's added hops to the first hop addition to boiling wort has seen the nucleation, the foaming that occurs when you add those hops to the kettle and then put the wort on top of it, or add those hops to the wort after you've removed your grain bag. It doesn't do that. And so I prefer not having a mess. And so I first wort hop all the time. But like you said, my experience doing that, I started doing that years and years ago, again, because I'm lazy and it's easier. But I didn't notice any qualitative impact on the beer. They all tasted the same to me, and our experiment results support that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so it's interesting that you have that difference, right? Where your experiment and the experiment's results and your own experience with it are sort of different than mine, and like anecdotally, right? I mean, and again, this is one of the reasons why we do the experiments themselves. Yeah. But that is a good point about adding the hops first wort, because if you're just going to raise it to a boil, and theoretically, if you can raise it to a boil quickly, raise the liquid to a boil quickly, if you're just adding those to the boil, you're just essentially doing a bittering addition, right? An early addition, to the boil. So how is it going to change the character? Maybe it's not going to change very much, especially if you just ramp up quickly.
Yeah.
When you're doing that first wort hop addition, and again, you're boiling off a lot of other aromatic compounds, like fruity flavors that would be, more from late hop additions. So I can see where, even though my experience, I would say, is different, I can see where the science sort of backs up the other side of this. And having never done a first wort hop experiment myself, or putting myself through a triangle test, I can easily say I notice a difference.
I would say that I don't believe in magic, that there's always sleight of hand going on. And when it comes to first wort hopping, I feel like it's spoken of in these magical terms almost. Like, well, if you just add them in before the boil, then something magical happens that makes it different. And I just don't buy it. And we have not been able on a perceptible level to support that claim. And I've not on an anecdotal level perceived a difference either. And so I just do it for the practical purpose of reducing the foam up of adding that first 60-minute boil addition. Now, in terms of kettle hopping, obviously, we talk about it all the time. Everybody who got into brewing, before 10 years ago knows of the whole 60-minute, 30-minute, 15-minute breakdown. Early additions are for bitterness, mid-boil is for flavor, late kettle hopping is for aroma. Now, I feel personally that has been largely debunked. You've got a lot of people who are making perfectly balanced, well-bittered beers that they're boiling for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, and they taste fine. It's just a matter of adjusting those additions to ensure that you get the characteristics that you want.
Yeah, that's the key there, right? Like saying it's the adjustment to the additions, because if you boil a beer, put hops in, if you put an ounce of hops in at 60 minutes versus an ounce of hops in with 1 minute left in the boil, those beers are going to taste different, right? So there are things that happen in the boil that we've shown over thousands of years of brewing that make a difference. But the question is where and how much, right? And what's the adjustment?
Yeah.
Right. If you're totally eliminating bitterness in your beer, then and just adding hops in the dry hop, that's going to taste very different than a beer that you put 3 ounces of Citra in and boil for 60 minutes. So again, I think there is some. There's maybe some rules of thumb or some traditions that have come about for important reasons, and they do make a difference. But like you said, Marshall, you can make great beer by modulating all these things, and often there's a whole bunch of exceptions that sort of mitigate the rule of thumb or the rule. So the early editions, if we start there, those 60-minute to 40-minute editions, that's a huge traditional component. It's all about getting iso alpha acids into solution,
right?
And giving it enough time, right, to get into solution. That's the whole point of this, early addition is bitterness, because you're blowing off a whole bunch of other things, right, by boiling it for an hour or an hour if you're doing a 60-minute boil, or a 90-minute boil, you're boiling it for 90 minutes. There are things that are going to stay in solution, but the main thing is this bitterness component, and that is a really important part of beer, right? I mean, it's a really important part of especially like a German Pilsner, an IPA, an American Pale Ale, all these different styles of beer that you want to have substantial ABV, so you need something to offset the sweetness, or you want some residual sugar, and you need something to make, to lift that cloying, mouthfeel off of your palate. So there are a whole bunch of reasons for doing early additions.
So we know that isomerization is a function of temp and time, right? And time in the boil. So traditional as it may be, and as atraditional as I may come off most of the time, I actually still do 30 to 60 minute boils because I like the bitterness quality that I get from that, one. But two, I also like using less hops for bitterness particularly. Now, when it comes to certain styles of beer, in my experience, there are certain styles that benefit from certain hop varieties being boiled for certain amounts of time. If I want to make a classic, what I call a Pacific Northwest IPA or Pale Ale, which is that more pine-driven, sharper bitterness, yet still balanced with that malt character, right? When I think of a Pacific Northwest IPA, I'm thinking more of a caramel color, kind of a coppery colored IPA that has that sharper bitterness. What I like to use is a little bit of Chinook at that 60-minute mark, or even at the 30-minute mark, but then I'll balance that Chinook with something else, something with lower cohumulone, because we've shown, I know that there are people out there who will disagree that, CoH or cohumulone has an impact on the way bitterness is perceived, but we've done experiments that seems to support this idea that higher coho hops do impart a sharper bitterness or some other quality than lower CoH hops. And I think that's really interesting. So what I've done is, if I'm going to reduce the boil, I will throw in, for a classic P&W, IPA or Pale Ale, I'll throw in some Chinook, but then I'll balance it with something like Magnum or Simcoe even, to ensure that you get some of that flavor, that hop flavor, without being too sharp in the bitterness.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about bitterness quality. And so this is something that's super important for commercial brewers, especially German brewers. There's decades of research that have been done by German brewers looking at the quality of bitterness. I mean, I had Martin Beindel on the Brew Lab podcast a little while back, and he was talking about a new class of compound, not new class, it's one that's there, but these bittering polyphenols that had only recently started being studied, like in the 2010s to 2020s, that are being studied as contributing the quality of bitterness, and that's so important. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so hard or hasn't really carried over as much to homebrewing practices is because it's so dependent on the hop that you use, and sort of the starting materials of the hops. I mean, you mentioned like Chinook for a Northwest IPA. Magnum is pretty much my go-to. In either U.S. Magnum or German grown Magnums, it's pretty much my go-to for higher alpha, hops for bittering additions. But that's not to say that you can't use Magnum later in the boil. It's just that's kind of been what I go to. I love the clean bitterness that it gives. And when I say clean bitterness, I mean, there's not a whole lot of other characteristics that are coming along with it. Maybe some increased floral and spicy notes, but not a lot. It's mostly just bitterness for me. But then there's also the classic one, right? The classic bittering hop, Columbus Tomahawk Zeus CTZ. I think that's actually the number 3 grown hop in the U.S. behind Citra and Mosaic.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you think about it, it's probably like, Bud Miller Coors and a lot of commercial breweries that are using it for their hop extracts and for other things like that, for bittering components. But yeah, I mean, it's that one also I love as well. Zeus is the German version. Columbus is our version, and I don't know where Tomahawk is grown, but maybe it's just a proprietary or trademarked name for Columbus. But in any event, it's all the same hop. Genetically identical, but it's a nice one for bittering. And then another one that people might not think about as a bittering hop is Citra, and that one's got a high alpha acid component to it. And a lot of these aromatic varieties that we're getting these days have high alpha acids, and so you could think about that one as well. Although you got to have a little bit of like Heath Ledger's Joker in you, where you just like burning things and setting the world on fire if you're going to use Citra
because of how expensive it is.
Because it's just so expensive, and you get things like CTZ for way cheaper and Magnum for way cheaper. But I mean, and then of course another thing, don't forget those noble varieties. I love Tettnang or Mittelfrüh or Satz as a bittering addition. And that's only like 4% alpha acid. I love those as bittering additions.
Well, and you consider how much you need to add to achieve the bitterness you're looking for, and that is going to contribute flavor and aroma. It's why Czech Pilsner or German Pilsner exists. They had to add a ton of those hops early on in the kettle, and that carries through in some way into the finished beer. Now, I remember you mentioned Citra as a bittering hop, and I remember all this talk a few years ago about beers that had a kind of a danky kind of cannabis aroma, maybe cat pee as well, and that some people were purporting that could be a function of when, or the variety of hop being added and when it gets added in the kettle. And I don't know where I heard this from, but it became the talk amongst my local homebrew group. You don't use Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, and there was I think Amarillo. If you add it to your kettle before 20 minutes left in the boil, you're more likely to get this kind of cat pee, danky character out of it. I have never experienced that in my, I've come to accept that that's usually more a function of how long those hops stayed on the vine. And so if you get kind of later harvested versions of those hop varieties, you tend to get more of that characteristic. But it is something that I remember being talked about quite a bit in my circle of friends.
Oh, yeah. No, I was going to say that's exactly been my experience as well. It's the maturity level, how long the hop sits on the vine that leads to those characteristics. But who knows? Maybe there is something in the boil. I don't know. I've never done research on it, but maybe there is.
Now, so in thinking about mid-boil additions, again, we are talking about a standard 60-minute boil. So by mid-boil, we're referring to that 40 to 20-minute mark left in the boil. There's really not much in my experience that I've found. I know a lot of people just skip this altogether now because they feel like you're kind of splitting the difference between bitterness and aroma. You're going to get flavor out of later additions and earlier additions anyways. I believe it was maybe it was Matt from Firestone Walker, who had mentioned something about using a traditional, English hop variety at the 30-minute mark in a bunch of his beers because he felt it adds like a mid-palate fullness. I started doing that, and I've not tested it out, but I'll tell you, I do think I get what he's talking about. You throw in a half ounce or an ounce of Fuggles hops at that 30-minute mark in the boil when you're making a nice IPA or a pale ale, and to me, it really does bring something out. I've done it with Mount Hood, which is a American analog to like a German noble hop. I've done it with a Willamette, which I believe is a American analog of Fuggles, and it works. I like what I get from it. It adds this unique fullness that isn't just fruity or floral. It's just kind of this nice full hop character that kind of coats your palate.
I totally get what you're saying. I mean, it's this complete hop flavor. It's like it's missing something if you just use bittering hops or just cold side hops. You're just missing this roundness. You're missing the complete hop character. And it turns out, like I'd mentioned a little bit ago, like linalool and geraniol are these oxidized hop acids that are, oxidized terpenes that stick around in the boil. And so there's a lot of hops that are high in those, like Cascade and Fuggles. Right? Those are good ones. Oh, another one that's new, El Dorado, is a good one to put in the middle of the boil because it adds these, I don't know, maybe it's floral, but I always just called it as like traditional hop character. I mean, I think about like from a very basic perspective, if you serve somebody a beer that knows very little about beer, and they go, oh, that's got hops in it. That's what I'm talking about. It's that like, oh, that's that hops. It's not like, oh, it's fruity and pineapple, or oh, it's got floral and spicy. It's like, oh no, that's hop. Yeah. That's what hop character is. And to me, this is where it comes from, is that mid-boil addition. So you'll see me still doing that mid-boil addition a lot. And I think even Scott Janish was talking about, doing some additions in the boil and how those contribute to his hazy IPAs, right? Hazy IPAs, that style that's known for very little boil additions and just a huge amount in the whirlpool and in the dry hop. But he was saying, I think he'd done some experiments saying, no, look, I mean, you need some bitterness and you need some of that rounded hop flavor to offset and to make just make the beer more complex and not as one-dimensional.
That's my opinion. I like the fullness that you get. You know, the word spice has come to mean so many different things. Using it to say like when you know that those times when you're eating a meal and you're kind of like, God, something's missing here, and maybe you add a little gochugaru, or you add a little a little sriracha, or you add some salt or whatever it might be, and it just brings the meal together, brings that food together. To me, that's what I get from that mid-boil edition. It's a nondescript, quote, spice-like character. When I drink a fresh Union Jack off the on tap, that beer to me has this fullness that is so hard to describe other than it's just right. It's just good. And I wonder to what extent that I would love to taste that beer professionally made without that mid-boil addition. I'd be curious to know, and we're saying mid-boil, I'm sure on the professional scale, it's different timings. Who knows if they're even boiling with hops or not, but I would love to taste it without whatever that addition is to see how different it is. But in my experience, again, adding a little dose, a half ounce for a 5-gallon batch of Fuggles or Willamette at that 30-minute mark in the boil for an IPA just does the trick for me. It adds that nice fullness. Now, when it comes to making late kettle additions, we're talking that 20-minute to kind of 1-minute mark in the kettle. I have done so many iterations and have tried so many different things. And what I've settled on, I know it sounds stupid. It's probably very subjective, but when I make a huge 2-minute addition mark, so there's 2 minutes left in the boil, I've found, at least in my opinion and my experience, that I get a ton of hop aroma out of that. It's almost like the sweet spot, to me, that you get all of that extraction from those hops that you want, and it seems to stay in the beer.
Yeah. I mean, this is there's so much here too, right? Like on what your system, because I don't know how long it takes you to chill, probably really quickly. And you're probably not doing a whirlpool stand after that, are you?
No. And we're going to talk about that in the next segment. But no, that's the part of the reason that I adopted the 2-minute edition was I had read, I think it was a BYO article from years and years ago about how the whole whirlpool thing was something that home brewers stole from the professional, brewers. And the reason pros do it is way different. Home brewers would never need to do that. So I kind of mangled, those findings and applied them in my own brewery, and it seemed to work really well.
Yeah, I mean, the reason brewers use a whirlpool is because of space. They need the kettle to do other things. So they just dump everything over into the whirlpool, and then because whirlpooling can take a long time,
and that wort is still very hot. You're still getting a lot of the same impact as you would at a 2-minute addition.
Exactly. I mean, a whirlpool can take 45 minutes in the commercial scale, right? So, I mean, it can take a long time. So you're exposing your hops to a lot more temperature, which is also, too, a lot of breweries now are even doing just 20-minute boils because it takes so long to raise the boil or the heat all the way up and then cool the beer or the wort all the way back down. So yeah, I mean, this late addition though is something I've explored a lot too. And late additions I think traditionally are anywhere from 20 minutes until, the end of boil, like 1 minute or so. But I don't really get close to that 20-minute mark anymore. Like you, Marshall, I'm within that like 5-minute area. Yeah. I don't even like to do 10-minute additions. I just feel like, and this is totally me being anecdotal. I get something from 60 minutes, I get bitterness. I get something in the middle of the boil, that rounded, complete hop flavor that I talk about. And then at the very end of the boil, less than 5 minutes, I get this wonderful, fruity, tropical aroma. I love adding El Dorado right at the end of the boil. Like you said, with like 2 minutes, you just get this kind of like, I don't know, it's like, what's those like strawberry candies? You know what I'm talking about? They like look like a little strawberry and you unwrap them and they're gooey in the middle.
The grandma's candy dish candy.
Grandma's candy dish strawberry candies. Yeah, that's what I get from El Dorado at the end of the boil there. And I love it in a lot of different styles of beer. Even a porter. I love having that in there because it just gives this nice like candy flavor to it. But I mean, you can use anything at that time. Like classics are like the Cascade, the Citric, Galaxy, Mosaic, Simcoe, all of your aromatic hops. This is where they're made to shine. And this is where a lot of hops are coming into play, right? Most of your hop, load is going to be at this point or later, right? In whirlpool or dry hop. You're not using a lot to bitter. And so I think this is one of those places where there's been so much exploration recently, and I love adding late hops to my beers.
Yeah, so do I. And the thing is I like I said, I brew mostly pale lager, amber lager, stuff like that. That's not highly hopped. even in those, what I like to do is if I'm using, I highly prefer Tettnanger. I think it's one of the best flavored and aromatic hops out there for the styles that I enjoy the most. I'll even throw in a small, 7 gram or 10 to 14 gram Tettnanger addition at the 2-minute mark when I'm making a less hop forward style, just because to me, it really does carry the freshness of that hop character carries through in the finished beer. And it doesn't make it a hoppy beer per se, but it certainly has that pop. To me, it sends the message that this is a fresh beer. And I love that. And so I'm kind of like you. If I'm doing a 60-minute boil, I'm doing a 60-minute boil addition for bitterness, because why not? You're going to get more isomerized alpha acids there. I do sometimes, like I said, will blend hops there. Usually only if I'm doing a IPA, particularly of the West Coast and Pacific Northwest versions, because I want to get some of that sharpness, but I also want to balance it with that smooth, like you said, kind of Magnum-like, or I love Horizon for bittering as well. Super clean
Horizon's
hop.
a great one.
Yeah, it's great. And so, but then for mid-boil, if I'm reducing actually, if I'm doing like a short and shoddy batch where I'm just boiling for 30 minutes, I almost always do a hop blend. And the way I think about it is, okay, I'll use Magnum for my bittering, but then I'm also going to add, this what I would normally throw in at mid-boil at the same time. So I might pair, if I'm making a pale ale, I might pair that Magnum with some Fuggles to try to extract that same character I get out of a 60-minute boil. And my experience is that it works fairly well. And so that's kind of how I look at it. With late kettle hop additions, it's all about, for me, I'm going to go around that 2-minute mark and I'm going to balance the characteristics that I want. If I want high citrus, I might go with something like, 20 grams of Citra, 20 grams of Centennial, but then I might throw in also 5 or 6 grams of something even more pungent, like a Lupamax variety, just to kind of get that kind of, overripe kind of pungency that I hope carries through in the finished beer. And it's worked out really well for me using that approach.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, blending hops there in the late boil, I think, is important. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to blend hops at the beginning, because at the beginning, like at 60 minutes in the boil, because so much is just bitterness there. But don't forget the classic smash pale ale, right?
Yeah.
Sierra Nevada, right? Sierra Nevada pale ale is Cascade, 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 and Cascade, right? And that's it.
Cade, I used to think that, and somebody corrected me and said they actually use a lot of Chinook in that beer. So I don't know what the recipe is. I'm not sure if Ken or Brian has ever shared it, but it does taste like Cascade. I'll give them that.
Well, but then maybe I'm totally wrong, and if I'm totally wrong, then that's the case. But man, that beer is grapefruit on grapefruit on grapefruit to me, and that's where you're getting it is from that late boil addition and the dry hop addition. And so maybe they're using something other than Cascade. I know some people at Sierra Nevada, so I might ask them just for my own personal, interest. But yeah, I mean, don't forget those smash beers too, because this is a great opportunity to just play around with hop character by throwing it in late in the boil. You can almost immediately smell what the hop character is going to be like. And then it's really fun to see how it goes through biotransformation and fermentation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, that gets us through the boil. But as any brewer knows, that's not the end of the story when it comes to hopping. We'll be getting to other approaches to hopping beer when we're back from this break.
Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERitor, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERitor.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
I will never forget the first IPA I ever made. I've talked about it on the show before. It was predicted to have 120 plus IBU from a huge 60-minute edition hop charge, which I believe was all Chinook, with only a couple other kettle editions. If you were served this beer today and told it was an IPA, you'd likely laugh me out of the pub, as it possessed little in the way of hop aroma, just bitterness. Now, these days, brewers rely on a number of methods to impart their beer with crazy levels of desirable hop character, not just bitterness, one of which occurs immediately after the boil, before the wort is transferred out of the kettle.
Yeah, I'm poignantly avoiding any discussion of IBU. In this
We're trying, right? Yeah.
In this experience episode. But just because, man, we'd spend a whole hour doing that. But so this is after the boil, or the flame out, the whirlpool, the hop stand, the knockout. What other terms can we throw in here to make it more complicated? But really, all it means is the point between where you're cooling the wort down. The flame is off, okay, flame out. It's also sometimes called knockout, which means when you're transferring it, to a different vessel. Yeah. And whirlpool, and then a hop stand. So all these things are slightly nuanced, but they generally mean this time frame after the boil, right? The boil is done. You've heated everything. You've done your 60 minutes or 30 minutes or however long you were boiling it. And now your focus is on either adding hop character or cooling it down and getting it over into the fermenter. So that's what we're talking about here, is adding hop character. And you can add a lot of hop character just in this area. And this is one of the big deals with hazy IPAs, right? I mean, hazy IPAs are known for just dumping in tons of hops right at this point. Right as the wort is chilling down, you're going to get some bitterness that's going to come through. You're going to get a lot of, those tropical and fruity characters that are going to come through from the terpenes. You're also going to get a lot of, just regular hoppy character. I consider like myrcene and linalool and geraniol, herbaceous, floral, all those sorts of things. Those are all going to come out during this time, that are heat assisted, to get into solution. And I think that's a really, really important aspect when you're talking about really hoppy styles. I don't see a lot of whirlpool editions for like German beers, or like, lagers, that kind of stuff. But really hoppy styles where you're trying to make the hops shine, there's a lot that you can do in this area.
This is an experience episode. So I'm going to talk about my experience real quick, defining each of these terms, because I feel like they do each have their distinctions. So when we talk about a flame out addition, that was the first term that I heard when I started brewing, was you cut the flame literally, and then you add hops. So your wort is still at boiling temp, 212 Fahrenheit, 100 C. It's still there. You toss in hops, and then you let it sit for a given amount of time. Obviously, the wort is going to chill a bit from that point. So if you did a 15-minute flame out addition, that just means you're tossing hops in, waiting 15 minutes, and then chilling the wort. Whereas a whirlpool addition, I feel, should be largely reserved for people who are actually performing whirlpools, which are commercial brewers. That's basically the same as a flame out, except they're added during the whirlpool step. So which in the commercial brewing world means that you are transferring wort to another vessel, and it's creating a literal whirlpool, and those hops that get added cone up at the bottom of that vessel. You can do that on the homebrew scale. We've talked about it recently. In fact, it's very difficult without a powerful pump and nothing in the way. So I use an immersion chiller every time I've tried to whirlpool, whether using a pump or a paint stirrer on a drill, or even just a spoon. I never actually get that cone at the bottom because it's broken up by the immersion chiller. So I don't do whirlpools. hop stand are, to me, the most unique and kind of the most interesting. That technically just means you're adding hops and letting the wort stand for a minute there, for however long. But for the most part, the way it was defined to me that I've accepted as being kind of the case is you chill your wort to a specific temperature, about 185 F, 85 C, maybe about 15 degrees lower, 7 degrees or so C lower than that. And then you add your hops and you hold it at that temperature for a given amount of time. And there's an argument that, you are not volatilizing certain terpenes that you want to remain in the beer. And so all of those, again, like I said, have this distinction, at least that I've accepted. Do I do any of them? Absolutely. 99% of the time I'm doing that classic flame out edition if I'm going to do it. And I'll leave the hops in the beer for 15 or 20 minutes. That being said, since we've done an experiment on, I believe it was a 20-minute addition in the boil, right? So again, end of the kettle, end of the boil. We compared that with one that was, I believe, flame out or had a hop stand for 20 minutes with the same amount of hops, and people could not perceive a difference in those beers. I've kind of been shying away from the flame out additions over the last few years because I don't know if it really has much of a perceptible impact. So why waste the time if it doesn't?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you may do, right? Again, so there's all these overlap between those words, like you said, right? Like flame out, whirlpool, hop stand, knockout. There's all these overlap because the main things that you're modulating here is the amount of hops that are in contact with wort at a specific temperature and the amount of time that they're there, right? So like Marshall was saying, if you do it in the boil at a 20-minute addition in the boil, it may not have that much of a difference from the whirlpool, because you might have extracted and you might get everything into solution that you need, which is interesting, right? Because I would say that things are going to boil out for aroma compounds at that 20-minute addition, just based on my own experience. But again, experiments can prove us wrong and sometimes have. But the key here in this area is how long you want the hops in this temperature that it's at. So you have a whole bunch of a sliding scale of wiggle room. And I think each brewer is going to do it differently. And that's going to contribute to what I would call as some of the brewer's thumbprint. Yeah. This is one of those areas where it's very hard to standardize. Because like Marshall was saying, he does his 2-minute boil edition, and he loves that 2-minute boil edition because it creates a lot of hoppy character. But Marshall's also not doing a whirlpool, and he's chilling his wort within, 10 minutes, let's say, of adding that. So those hops are in contact with the wort at a temperature where they can actually extract compounds for less than 15 minutes, right? Commercial brewers, when they're transferring over to a whirlpool, those hops are going to be in contact with boiling wort for, 10 to 15 minutes, and then 170 degree wort for another 20 or 30 minutes. And who knows, right? However long it's taking to do it. Commercial brewers, the systems are all going to vary. And so that's where, at the risk of overcomplicating this, this is where a lot of changes can happen to the beer based on hops.
Yeah, I absolutely accept that there may very well be a difference on the commercial scale versus the homebrew scale when it comes to these flame out whirlpool hop stand editions. And so I'm speaking purely based on my experience that I'm not seeing the benefit after a ton of experiences skipping that step altogether and just adding hops anywhere between 20 and 0 minutes, or I guess 1 minute in the kettle. I get the same characteristic that I'm looking for, or I guess what's desired as when I've done those later additions, those post-boil additions. So now let's talk a little bit about dry hopping. This is a huge area of focus, obviously, today, particularly with the hazy IPA craze, but also with any hoppy beer. Dry hopping is a defining characteristic and what you get from that. Now, we've done a lot of experiments on different types of dry hopping, whether you do it in secondary and the impact that might have compared to dry hopping in primary, the length of the dry hop, the temperature of the beer when you dry hop, all of this. What I've settled on is perhaps the simplest approach, which I like to dry hop just after high kreuzen. I don't know that biotransformation is a perceptible thing yet. I've tested it out perhaps not with the right hops or with the right yeast, but I didn't seem to notice much of a difference. So I tend to dry hop about 4 to 5 days into fermentation. I do a full dry hop. I don't do this double dry hop thing. We've tested that out as well. It doesn't seem to have much of an impact. So I skip that on my scale in my brewery. So I'll add all the dry hops about 4 days in, and then I'll leave them until fermentation is complete, which is usually only 3 or 4 days later. Again, that shorter duration, I believe Scott talks about this as well, does seem to extract everything that you want desirable from those hops. And so I stick with that, and it's been working great for me.
Yeah, there's so much disagreement over all this, right? With dry hopping, which I think is funny. I mean, you mentioned like biotransformation. I think a lot of the studies out there would agree with you, is that they're not really sure exactly what biotransformation is happening. But then you start to look at yeast strains like Cosmic Punch from Omega yeast, or some of the genetically modified strains from Berkeley yeast that are out there that are increasing beta lyase activity, that are releasing thiols, and then you start to say, oh well, crap, if I'm using SOTS, suddenly I'm using SOTS and I have this mango guava beer.
Yeah.
And I didn't expect that, but it's because the yeast is having that biotransformation impact. But like you said, I mean, their timing of dry hopping, the double dry hop, the thing. I mean, the whole point of a double dry hop. I mean, that was research that was done by Tom Shellhammer, and they found that there was a significant effect based on double dry hopping, based on the hops that they looked at. And then you get into sort of everything else, the timing of dry hopping additions. So Laura Burns at Omega Yeast did a study where she produced a clear hazy IPA. Yes, I said that on purpose. But she essentially put one quarter of the hops in at flame out or at knockout, and then all of the rest, so the other 3/4 of the hops, at day 7 after fermentation was done. Compared that with the beer where she did the same amount of hops at day 4, and the beers were totally different in terms of character and haze. One of them, the quarter knockout, 3/4 at day 7 was totally clear. The day 4 was hazy and had a stable haze, so it stayed hazy for the life of the beer.
Wild.
So there's all these different levers and things that you can tweak with dry hopping, from timing to when you pitch to biotransformation. It's a really, really fertile ground for research. And I think there's a lot of people that are looking into, how we improve these things. I mean, one of the people that graduated from Dr. Shellhammer's lab did his thesis on thiols and thiol release in beers. So that'll be interesting once the research gets published on that. I can't wait to see what I know what the conclusions are. I can't share them yet.
Don't tease us, Cade.
So, but that's going to be really fun to talk about. And there's a whole bunch of research that's been done into thiols, and will be done in the future. Oh, and that's not even to mention the whole dry hop saturation point thing, right? I mean, the 8 grams per liter, that was for tropical and overall hop aroma intensity. Although herbal and tea character did still continue to go up above 8 grams per liter. So that's I just dumped a whole bunch of like scientific data relating to dry hops on you. So hopefully all that made sense. But
I never tested the 8 grams per liter thing. That's a relatively new finding by Dr. Tom Shellhammer, of course, who is your advisor now, Cade. I don't think we should hide behind that. But we're not just promoting him because of that. We've been talking about him for years. But I have definitely, I remember there was a really good IPA that I made way back in the day where I thought I'm just going to throw heaps of hops at this beer and see what comes out. And I think I put like 6-7 ounces in this 5-gallon batch of a dry hop when my typical is 2 to 4 ounces. And that beer got done, and it wasn't bad. All I tasted was my normal beer, but with like a black tea character. And it was subtle, but I thought, boy, I wasted like $15 of hops on this beer, and I don't like it any more than I like my normal approach. And so I've stuck to that, kind of 2 to 4, depending on the strength of the beer, 2 to 4 ounces in the dry hop. It's almost always a blend of high potency fruity hops. And I just like it that way. And I don't know, what is that, about 8 grams per liter perhaps, but still, when I dry hop, I've kind of gone with this more moderate approach that to me and my palate and what I like in a hoppy beer just works really, really well. And so, again, that is style dependent. If I'm making a pale ale, a lot of people to this day, I'm learning, still don't like to dry hop pale ale. I like to put in a little bit of Cascade just to kind of bump up that kind of freshness factor. But overall, that's what my experience has shown me works the best for my brewery and my tastes is kind of a more moderate dry hop. And it works well. Again, I added about 4 days into fermentation once high krausen is dropped off, and trying my best, of course, not to introduce any oxygen. And it works great. So.
Yeah, and one other thing too we talk about is you can add dry hops at the end of fermentation, which is, I think, most common commercial practice. And so that's kind of carried over to home brewers too. If you're harvesting yeast and reusing them, you're going to have to harvest them before you add the hops in there. If you don't, you're just going to get all that like nasty hop character in there, and it's just not going to be an ideal condition for reusing your yeast. So that's also something to think about as well in terms of an experience. And the other thing I'll say too about dry hopping, especially if you're going to dry hop it, 5 ounces or 4 ounces or whatever in a 5-gallon batch, then like use a hop sock or a stainless steel canister unless you like clogging dip tubes.
Well, also to avoid all of the feedback that you're going to get for saying not to reuse yeast that has hops in it, dry hopping and then reusing that yeast. We have done experiments. If you go and you Google sloppy slurry, that's back in the days before we adopted the naming convention we use nowadays for our experiment articles. It does work really well. And in comparisons, we can't seem to taste a difference. Now, I think on the commercial scale, you obviously want to get the cleanest yeast possible. You are making a more consistent product, or a product that's expected to be more consistent. Now, we can't talk about dry hopping without talking about keg hopping. And all this means is that you probably dry hopped the beer already. You rack it to a keg that also has hops in it. Like you said, Cade, you want to keep those hops in a sock or some sort of a stainless mesh canister so that they don't get sucked up into your dip tube in your keg. But this is a method that people use, again, to maintain that hoppy, poppy hop character in their beer.
Yeah, and this was really interesting to me too. It's something that I don't have a lot of experience with, but again, the science is kind of interesting here because CO2 will actually bind to a bunch of the hop components, right? That are aromatic and nice. I mean, it's how hop extracts are made. They're CO2, supercritical CO2 extraction. So the idea here is like, if I'm dry hopping and I have an open blow off tube, the CO2 is picking up hop character and it's blowing hop character off. I don't know that that's actually the case based on my experience, but I'm telling you that that's what people will suggest. The idea behind keg hopping is, okay, CO2 is doing additional extraction while I've got this beer kegged. And a lot of people will just leave the bag in the keg the whole time until the beer is done, and just leave it in there. And it allegedly, creates a complex character. I mean, Ray, I think, was one of the Brewlosophy contributors that loved doing that. Is keg hopping and just leaving hops in there, and really enjoyed the experience. Like you said, it just makes this like fresh hoppiness. It's like sprinkling new spice into the beer as you keg it.
And never removing it. I mean, that's the key, right? Yeah. Now, I know people who keg hop by suspending, they use floss or fish line or whatever to somehow suspend a bag of hops or a canister of hops in their beer. And then as the beer gets lower, those hops eventually are no longer in solution, even though they're still in the keg. The idea being to avoid, vegetal or grassy off flavors or whatever. I've also had beers that are at the tail end of the keg that have the hops right there in the beer that don't ever pick up that grassiness. So I'm not sure that them being in the beer that long is necessarily having a negative impact. I will tell you, I've kegged hop a few times. I think I screwed it up both times that I can think of that I did it for whatever reason, but it ended up, the beers were good. The process didn't work out as well as other people have talked about. Now, I've had a keg hopped New England IPA or hazy IPA now from Ed Coffee that I'm telling you, as he was pouring this beer off the keg, you could smell it from 10 feet away. It was phenomenally hoppy. And I think that's the reason people do it, is that fresh, punchy hop character that you get from it. I think it's a completely valid approach that I know a lot of people locally and probably out there are still doing today to great success. So absolutely do it. I don't have too much experience, but the experiences that I do have seem to suggest that it does have an impact on an overall hop character.
Yeah, again, this is one where you're going to need to suspend a bag or a stainless, mesh filter. Otherwise, your hops are going to clog your dip tube. So just be thinking about that as well. And this is also one where I've heard negative experiences being around hop burn.
Yeah.
So just like having whatever too much hops in the keg or having too much extraction of those unwanted compounds that lead to that hop burn flavor. So play around with it. I mean, I think like with everything, there's balance.
Absolutely. Now, up until about a year and a half ago, I'd say that's where we would have ended this show because those were all of the, hop approaches that we've used, that we're familiar with, that we've heard about. But then I started hearing about this new approach to hopping beer that's called dip hopping. When I heard the term, I didn't know what it was yet, but I just presumed it meant taking a bag of hops or a canister of hops and dipping it into your beer, which sounded like an awful approach, an easy way to oxidize your beer, but that is not what it is at all. In fact, there's some similarities to another approach to hopping that I've used before, but all in all, basically what dip hopping is, based on my research, I've never done it. Cade, have you ever dip hopped?
Nope, never done it.
Okay, so based on my research, I just felt like even though this is an experience episode and we don't have experience doing it, I didn't want to leave it out. I feel bad for dip hopping. So basically what you do is you steep hops in about for a 5-gallon batch, you would steep about however much hops in about 1.5 liters of 180 degree Fahrenheit or 82°C water in the sanitized fermenter. You cap that fermenter off so as not to lose those aromatics. You do it for the entire length of the boil. So those hops and hot water, essentially a hop tea, are sitting in this fermenter for about an hour. And then you can also use wort, apparently, but I think most people are using water. At least that's what I found on YouTube. Then you rack the wort from the kettle once the boil is complete and you've chilled that wort onto this hop tea in the fermenter, and you proceed as usual. Now, I've never done it, but it seems very, very familiar to me to dry hopping at yeast pitch, which we have done quite a few times. In fact, I have heard from listeners of the show who say that that is the approach that they prefer nowadays because of how easy it is, and they're getting massive amounts of dry hop character by doing that. You don't necessarily, again, based on my experience, based on the anecdotal reports of other people, you're not necessarily losing any of the dry hop character. In fact, some believe that you might be gaining something, whether that's through biotransformation or something else. I'm not sure, based on what I've read about dip hopping, how that would have much of a benefit. Now, I do want to say I watched a really neat video by YouTuber Main Brew Guy Gary. I think his YouTube channel is called Main Brew Guy Gary, all one word. He did a really nice comparison of a dip hopped IPA to one that had whirlpool hops. So in his anecdotal comparison, now this was not a triangle test. He wasn't serving it to other people. The beers, he said, and I looked at the video, look the same, but he said that the aroma of the dip hopped IPA was more overripe fruit, while the whirlpool beer had more pine to it. He felt they smelled like totally different beers. Now, I think that's really interesting, and I don't know what would cause that.
Well, I mean, one thing I can think of, if you're just dip hopping in water, you're not using ethanol there, or which is alcohol, right? You're not using alcohol. So alcohol will extract other compounds into the beer, which might overtake whatever he's looking at as the overripe fruit. But I don't know. This is fascinating to me. I'm learning too, by the way, listeners. I have no idea what's going on. Marshall's teaching me here as well. Anytime I hear overripe fruit, I'm starting to think thiols, thiol character. And so that makes me wonder, are thiols being extracted in water, but they're not, but other things are being extracted with, ethanol solutions that are maybe like covering up the overripe fruit, that thiol character. Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you, there are a lot of great videos on YouTube, all of them within like the last year or so. Chip Walton, Chop and Brew, he did a great one. Martin Keene from the Homebrew Challenge did a fantastic video on dip hopping. And then, like I said, this Main Brew Guy, Gary, is the one that I'm referring to here because he did a comparison, which, these things take a lot of work. Again, it's his anecdotal experience that we're talking about here, but he seemed to prefer the dip hopped beer. Now, this was an IPA. I believe he even mentioned if there was another style, he might have preferred the whirlpool hopped one more. But it does seem, at least according to these folks out there on YouTube, that dip hopping imparts a unique characteristic versus whirlpool hopping or potentially even just kettle hopping. And so it's something that we have planned to experiment more with. I'm really excited to see what happens in a comparison that we do and serve to blind tasters. But until then, that is all the time we've got for this episode. We've talked a lot about our approaches to hopping beers and the various fashions that we do. Do you have any final words on your experiences hopping different beers, Cade?
I'm excited to experiment with dip hopping and checking out these things. But there's so much that we didn't get to cover today, right? We just have an hour to talk about approaches to hopping beer. So if you have questions, just let us know. Shoot us an email, Cade@Brewlosophy or Marshall@Brewlosophy, and we'll do what we can to answer them.
Absolutely. Well, don't forget to check out our podcast, The Brew Lab, where Cade takes you into the lab with real brewing experts to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we're up to.
The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.